I'll try to make it not too brief, but just cover the most important things that I think you should take away from this. So I'm Steve Bono. I'm a founder and principal security analyst of Independent Security Evaluators. We are a computer security consulting firm based out of Baltimore, but also with a West Coast presence down here in San Diego. And we specialize in helping our customers who support infrastructure or build products, and even those with supply chains. We help them identify risks to those systems that may be more advanced or targeted than your traditional security practices often do. What I mean by advanced versus unsophisticated is that there's a different level of, first of all, skill that the adversary has, but also the commitment in which they would put towards these attacks. And untargeted versus targeted, we'll talk about here on the next slide when I speak about the different assets that we help our customers protect. Patient records, I think the most important one on here is definitely patient health, but it's listed as number 3 only because I don't think there's a lot of cybersecurity built around that particular asset yet. Patient records, though, definitely this is what we've all been focused on. There's big money here on the black market and stealing these records. As David mentioned, they're much more valuable than just a credit card number. And as long as there's a lot of money there, there's going to be attacks to obtain these assets. But most of the attacks we see today are largely untargeted when it comes to patient records. They may target an organization, such as your hospital, but they don't really care what record they get. A record is a record equals some amount of money. So as soon as they have any difficulty, they just move on to the next organization that can get where they can obtain these records. And as long as they can keep finding the lowest bar in which to compromise these assets, they're not going to become much more sophisticated than simply targeting the individuals, targeting internet-facing services that are weak, and or just physically stealing these devices or any hardware that happens to have storage on it containing patient records. But in a more advanced setting, over the last 5 years or so, we've seen what's called the advanced persistent threat start targeting organizations that have intellectual property assets and R&D assets, pharmaceutical companies, biotech, even hospitals that have these R&D departments will become victim to foreign nation states who want to obtain this information either for economic or business advantage. And these attacks are on a totally different scale than what you're used to seeing when when protecting patient records. They involve coordinated teams of individuals who will spend months and months infiltrating a network before and slowly exfiltrating those high-value assets, which might be diagrams or chemical makeups and things of that sort. And that's only been happening over the last 4 to 5 years, but that's been publicized probably only the last 2 years. But patient health is one that hasn't really hit the media yet. To my knowledge, there's been no cyber attack in real life. I mean, and on TV there has been, and in research communities there have been. But I don't know of any cyber attacks against an individual in order to cause harm that have happened through the medical system. But I believe that in the next 10 years, the opportunity is there. These systems are vulnerable. We're going to see these sorts of targeted attacks, and they're going to either target an individual or a group of individuals. The CIO of Hogue mentioned earlier that reputation is an important asset to him, and it's an important asset to everyone, so is service availability. But I have these sort of smaller and down at the bottom because they're usually only important to the stakeholders themselves, and there's not a lot of value for the adversary in going after these particular assets, so we kind of classify them a little bit differently. And it would be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. So in case it seems science fiction that can I use a medical device to hurt an individual, we've shown, or the research community has shown several times through pacemakers and insulin pumps, that these devices that connect to wireless base stations can be covertly compromised and used to either disable those devices, which could be critical, or to have them deliver a lethal shock or an inappropriate dosage level to one of the patients, possibly injuring or killing that patient. because these work over some radio spectrum, it was originally thought, well, you need $30,000 worth of equipment to launch one of these attacks. That's not true anymore. You can build these with commodity available components. This is Jerome Radcliffe, who was mentioned in David's talk. That's the device he used that he built himself for a couple $100. And I mean, I don't think anybody here should think that it's going to stay science fiction forever, that these attacks are possible. Here is a patent that I searched for web server enabled medical device, and I found a patent where it is called a web enabled portable medical device, mentioning insulin pumps. And if this were the situation, rather than in Mr. Radcliffe's situation, where you can actually access these devices over the internet, we have a whole new ballgame of vulnerability. Teenagers can launch attacks against these things now, not just somebody with the engineering capability to build an attack apparatus. And the more and more of these devices that are configurable over the network, the more and more the risk is. It just grows exponentially with every attack surface we add. So our traditional thinking was outdated probably 15 years ago when it was adopted, but it didn't matter as much then because there weren't as many attackers. It was to target the people, target the internet-facing services, or to walk on site and steal something. And we came up with traditional defenses, train our people, put up firewalls and intrusion detection, and put in a security guard. Modern attacks simply don't work that way. They circumvent all of these efforts, and they look a little bit more like this. Now, when you think of an infrastructure, we have BYOD. That seems probably a nightmare for any CIO here. These, as David mentioned, USB devices and other peripherals will be sent by the adversary, actually physical devices sent on site, hoping you'll plug them in. Doctors are working remotely, so are techs and other vendors. You have networks that may be connected to your network through a vendor that you don't even know about. Medical devices themselves are just one new attack surface in this whole ecosystem. But these medical devices, not only are they hooked into a patient, but they can be, because of the configurable interfaces on them, they could be a stepping stone into the network itself. And of course, users use the internet in all sorts of different ways now, downloading things, emails, browsing. It's not just we put up a firewall, it stops things from coming in. All of these are within the perimeter that you're trying to protect. So if you feel right now that you have a hard perimeter with a soft inside, you need to start rethinking the way you've shaped your security posture probably today. That's an extra slide. And there's a lot of new, different, unique examples of where these medical devices are being used too. In the telemedicine setting, we not only have, we no longer have the hospital infrastructure at all to protect us. This could be in a person's home, or in a school, or a rural setting, or at any remote location where the only people protecting this medical device from attack are the guy who configured that wireless router. And we know that wireless routers are notoriously insecure. And these sorts of environments need to be taken into consideration with all the deployment of these medical devices from here on out. And of course, implantable and wearable medical devices, they have a knack for connecting, or all of our wireless devices have a knack for connecting to things that they weren't supposed to. And if, in the case of the insulin pumps and the pacemakers, they were targeted, and those base stations, they weren't searching for a base station, but as we move on and technology becomes more and more standardized, we're going to be able to create rogue and malicious base stations that work with all of these new medical devices. And now we won't just be wearing them in a hospital or at home, but possibly wearing them in public at a convention hall or Times Square or at a protest where there may be many people with wireless accessible medical devices where they could be targeted in a group setting. So of these different types of attacks, there are a few solutions that we've all been sort of thinking about. We've been dealing with regulation, we've been dealing with penetration tests and black box security assessments, and in some cases, we've even been passing the buck and hoping that if I'm a hospital, well, it's up to the medical device manufacturer to be the one who provides the security, and perhaps the device manufacturer thinks, my device will be on a hospital network, it should not be accessible by your outside threat, so it's not my responsibility either. These are all anti-solutions, not because they're not the right solution for untargeted attacks that require low sophistication and do not typically have a victim in mind. Regulation will help you prevent, or those regulatory statutes will help you prevent those sorts of attacks by raising that bar just above the bar of your neighbor. But if you rely on these things too stringently, you'll find that they don't actually help you in the face of an intelligent adversary. The only way to fight off someone who wants what you have is through your own intelligence. You have to be smarter than they are, and you have to be more diligent than they are. And so building a defense-in-depth infrastructure where you have layered security, you expect defenses to fail. Don't just have a hard perimeter, but instead have that hard perimeter with more and more layers behind it. And a very robust security plan for identifying where assets are, where they will be throughout the network, and segmenting the network so that critical assets stay here, patient records stay here, certain devices stay over here, and monitoring those systems in an effort to quickly identify where attacks may be occurring, because they will, and they will succeed at some point. You need to be ready to quickly identify them, eradicate them, and then clean up afterwards to find out how they got in, what was stolen. And that's a good way to help prevent against or deal with the limits on when a certain number of patient records are stolen. A lot of times we have to announce that publicly because we just don't know how many were stolen. If you can better keep track of all of these assets within your networks, you have a much better chance of not facing those consequences. And you should never be passing the buck at all. It's really all of our responsibilities, even down to the patient's responsibility to make sure that the equipment that they're using is secure, but the patient does not have the ability or the bandwidth to make those sorts of decisions, so it's on us to do it. And we need to empower our CIOs and our CISOs to demand proper security from the vendors and from the medical device manufacturers. They have to not only demand the security, but demand proof of the security, and to demand that they verify that security themselves. If the CIO can't do it himself, in some sense, you need to be kicking the tires of these devices as they come in to make sure they're not vulnerable to these sorts of threats. And so I sort of blazed through that pretty quickly in just a few minutes. So hopefully we still have time for questions.
You did a very good job doing that quickly. Okay, we have a microphone for anyone with questions, and we'll take maybe 3 questions, if there are any. Okay.
You better ask questions or I'll start talking. You mentioned the FDA mask that some medical, like Siemens, vendors have, and you said just call the FDA and then challenge the vendor if they're saying, well, you can't load antivirus on this. I mean, is that all you have to do? Is there what is the process for going through that? Can you elaborate?
Very briefly, I was faced with that exact same issue, and my director of biomedical devices told me that is untrue, that the FDA doesn't, unless the device manufacturer significantly changes the function or operation, that you can do patches, upgrade. So what he did was call the FDA, and we turned it into an event locally. We had the Texas Medical Center, so there were a lot of big institutions. The FDA sent a representative in and basically said it isn't true. We always get blamed. We don't tell the device makers they can't do this. We certify a configuration, and their job is to maintain that configuration. And so if it's tested to take patches or updates, which it should be if they're doing it right, They don't have to go back through recertification. That's the myth. Does not have to be recertified. So start with the device maker, and if they are giving you the story, call the FDA.
Other questions?
There's a lot of interest in a variety of devices for in-home patient monitoring. And some of these are consumer-based devices as opposed to from experienced medical device companies. Can you just talk about that in any shape or form?
Sure. So installing these things on your home networks I wouldn't put too much trust in one or the other over the other. From what we've seen, the commercial medical device manufacturers and the ones for home use, they have very similar vulnerabilities. They're not built to withstand these types of attacks that target them directly. The chances of having one of these devices on your home network is more likely to expose your home network than it is to really expose the patient health. But that it depends on what the device is meant to do, really.
The home monitoring, I think, is part of the nightmare waiting to happen. You can get the attachment for your iPhone and do an EKG, and it's really cool. My question to a cardiologist would be, if he were having a heart attack, would he lay the iPhone on his chest and send it to his consultant? I mean, it's terrifying when you think of the remote monitoring. They're going to fall under some degree of regulation, and the new guidance actually gets into that. If a device is patient touching and is used in clinical decision making, it's going to be regulated, which should help in some of those cases.
We have one last question here, and then we'll wrap up and take a break, but we have an announcement to make before we break.
Yeah, great presentation. I think you really hit the nail on the head with, this is something that the community is really facing all around. With so much legacy devices, modalities, imaging equipment, it's already on there. It's hard to really achieve any quick wins. So what do you recommend as far as building like a long-term strategy to helping to address, not so much the new devices coming in, but these older devices that are still out there?
The first thing in a long-term strategy is to start educating yourself on modern thinking and how to secure your network or your infrastructure. Build that plan out and take care of these things over time. Identify old systems and schedule them to be either decommissioned or put in an area of the network where they are more heavily monitored, so that if these are the most likely, the easiest to exploit, you want to be keeping closer watch on them. But this network awareness is a huge part of security. And so building that medical device awareness into that part of that network awareness is the best strategy to identify old equipment. But a long-term plan is necessary for everyone, and it should incorporate defense in depth, least privilege, audit, fail-safe measures, and a whole slew of other modern techniques.